Good morning. Today is Women's Ministry's World Day of Prayer. And the theme this year is, I will go to reach my world. All of us build our foundation of faith on prayer. And we've had special emphasis this week, just praying for the various needs, particularly of women. But as you know, women are only part of our society. So it encompasses us, all our families as well. It's through prayer that our faith in God grows as we see Him enabling, guiding and comforting us through hard times. The presentation today focuses on the impossible things that God calls us to do, and it presents examples of women in the Bible who are called to do impossible tasks. He made it possible for them by giving them strength through His grace. These people were faithful to God. Now, these stories were written by Daniela Schubert, and she serves as the discipleship team member for the women of the South Pacific Division. In a lot of churches around today, this particular program is being done. Today, we hear stories about people who faced difficult situations. These are stories that really happened. Each person had to make a life-changing decision. If they had made a different choice, history would have been different, both for them and for their nation. Now, children, I want you to listen carefully, because as we tell these stories, I want you to try and guess who the character is, because it won't be revealed until the end of the story. So now we'll have our first story. Thank you.
I will go. She was very beautiful, young and unmarried. And like many other women at that time of their lives, she often wondered what her future would look like. Will she get married and stay, or will she stay single and remain living with her parents? And if she does get married, what will the man be like that she'll marry? Will he be handsome? Will he be rich? And will he be kind to her? I wonder what qualities in a man would have been on her list. It was common in those days for young women to marry a distant relative, but there were none of her relatives living around that village. She knew they did have relatives who had moved far away, but they never visited. One of her daily duties was to go and get water for the family. Sometimes she would go with the other women in the village, and sometimes she went all on her own. This particular day, she went all on her own, and as she neared the well, she saw a foreigner. She knew that he was a stranger because he had camels resting nearby. And she knew all the people in the village, so it wasn't very difficult to spot that he was a stranger. She was curious. Who was he? Where did he come from? And what was he doing here? Was this just a stopover, or had he come to see somebody in the village? She had no idea that within the next 24 hours her life would change tremendously due to this man. Her thoughts were interrupted when he requested a drink of water. Quickly, she drew some water and gave it to him. But her hospitality went even further, and she offered to water the camels. Oh, he could not believe this. because watering camels was very difficult, but she was a strong woman. Little did she know that this man had requested a sign from God, and that sign would be that she should water the camels. She was fulfilling what he had requested. She noticed that he was watching her very intently while she was working, and then she saw him take something out of his bag. It was a gold nose ring and 2 gold bracelets, and he gave it to her. She was pleasantly surprised. What young woman wouldn't like a lovely gift like that? Then he asked her some questions. Whose daughter are you? And do you think your father would have room for me for the night? She quickly answered very politely and said she was sure that he would have room for them for the night. Then he said to her, I am Abraham's servant, and I am a relative of yours. She quickly ran to the family and told them what had happened at the well. Her brother ran down to welcome this guest. When they got home, the family cared for the camels and their handlers, and they prepared food for them. But the man would not eat until he had disclosed the reason for his visit. The man that told the story of how he asked God for a sign so that he may choose the right woman for a marriage for his master. And the young woman who he had met at the well fulfilled that very same sign. He told them that he had come to look for a wife for his master's son, and that she would be the one to marry him. Oh, the family agreed, seeing that he was a relative. Then the man felt he could relax and he had something to eat. The next morning, he got up very early and he said he wanted to leave immediately. They were surprised because they still needed about 10 days to say their goodbyes and to arrange for a wedding. But he said no, he had to leave immediately and an answer had to be given now. The family agreed, but of course, the young lady, she should agree. And so the family allowed her to make the choice. What was the answer? Well, they said, we'll call Rebecca and see what she thinks. That is found in Genesis 24, verses 57 and 58. So they called Rebecca. Are you willing to go with this man? They asked. And she replied, I will go.
It was a very difficult time, and the community was suffering from a cruel and oppressive foreign government with a military far superior than any other known government. In that time, a whole generation had become more used to the circumstances they had been born into, and after all, 20 years is a long time. But eventually, all cruel governments are toppled. And then a woman receives a clear message from God, and she needs to pass on this exciting news. God has a plan to deliver her people from a terrible oppression, and she needed to act immediately. She wanted to pass on the message from God to a man who would lead the people out of bondage. It was an amazing plan, and she was eager to put it into action ASAP, for she knew what God was going to do. God was going to lure the enemy forces to a large flat area near the river. This area became impassable when there was rain, something the enemies were totally unaware of. With their heavy fighting machines, this was the perfect trap, and the name of the man chosen to lead the revolt was meaning of the man's name was Thunderbolt. It all fitted perfectly. The enemy would be lured into this low-lying area, and their fighting machines would become bogged up to their axles from the heavy rain sent from God. It would then be easy to overpower the oppressing army, and the nation would be delivered from the enemy. This woman was well known and well respected. She served the community as a judge, and the people came to her constantly to resolve their disputes. So her request to fetch this man Thunderbolt was obeyed straight away. The people probably saw the excitement in her eyes and knew something was about to happen. However, her excitement was short-lived. When Thunderbolt came and heard the message that she had for him, he was not impressed or excited at all. Instead, he had a strange ultimatum for her. Until now in the Bible, we have only seen men go into battle. Women had other duties. This woman was a wife with a household to run. She was also a prophetess and a judge. She did not plan on being involved in this venture. She already had plenty to do and plenty on her shoulders. So, Thunderbolt said to her, "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." She probably couldn't believe what she was hearing. She was probably expecting something like, "Yep, sure thing, what a fantastic plan. I'm ready to do whatever you suggest." However, basically he said, "Nah, not interested, sorry." What would this woman do now? My question to you is, have you ever been in a situation where you are so busy going about your life, you are excited about the future ahead of you, and then something happens that demands you to completely change the way you look at things? What was this woman's answer to Barak's ultimatum? If we turn to Judges 4 verse 9, we will find, in paraphrase, "Very well," Deborah replied, "I will go."
There are different ways some people stand out from a crowd in a community. A sure way to achieve this for a woman is to marry a foreigner. The decision to marry someone outside one's own community is an important one to make, as the consequences usually last a lifetime. This woman did exactly that. She married a foreigner. And that was only the beginning of her amazing and often difficult life story. Her husband had a brother, and he also married a woman from her village. And we're not told who married first, but we can assume that it was easier for these two women to navigate around the people who were obviously talking about their decisions in the village when they were together. As the village talk subsided, she worked her way to fit into her new family where she now belonged. A lot of adjustments take place in a new marriage. Each person brings with them their habits, their mannerisms, their way of thinking, their culture and their religion. And these behaviors need to be respected, explored, understood, challenged, and possibly adopted. His belief was different from hers, but with time she began to accept his religion and his God. The first year of marriage passed, and there were no children to bless these young women. So there were no children to bless their households, but after the second year passed and there still weren't any children, the people started talking and speculating. Why were there no children for these two young women? A married woman in those times without children was not respected. But this was not the worst yet. The worst was yet to come. Her father-in-law had died a few years before she got married to her husband, and left her mother-in-law a widow. But then her husband and her brother-in-law both died. This was a devastating blow to the family. What sorrow fell on these three women? No husbands and no children to give them hope for the future. Then the news came that the famine in the land where her parents-in-law had come from was over and there was plenty of food available. Her mother-in-law wanted to go back. She discussed it with the two women and it was decided that all three of them would go back. Preparations were made, things were finalized, goodbyes were said. She was going to leave the place she was comfortable with, the people she knew, for a place she had never seen and people she didn't know. It probably wasn't an easy decision to make. And on the way, her mother-in-law petitioned her and her sister-in-law earnestly to stay in their village, where their families were and with which they were familiar. She probably realized it might be too much to expect these two young women to come with her. She had nothing to offer them where she was going and wasn't even sure how she herself would be expected back after 10 years of absence. She could hardly look after herself, let alone these two other women. So she urged the two women to go back to their village and start their lives again. It would be easier for them to return than to continue with her into an uncertain life. Have you ever been in a situation where life had given you so much grief that you had to make a choice leading to an uncertain future? Maybe you had to leave your homeland to go to another people, another culture. How difficult was that decision? The woman's sister-in-law decided that her mother-in-law had a valid point, so she reluctantly and tearfully said goodbye and turned back. But what was she to do? Join her sister-in-law and return to their relatives? Perhaps she would find another husband. Or was she to follow her mother-in-law and start a new life with any assurance that there would be a future for her? Her decision was very clear, and we can read it in Ruth chapter 1, verse 16. And I quote from the New Living Translation, "But Ruth said, 'Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. I will go wherever you go and live wherever you live.'"
Morning, everyone. He's doing what? She was shocked. He's covered with ashes. His clothes are torn. He is wailing loudly and bitterly and wearing sackcloth, her maids replied. This was terrible news. She had no idea what on earth was happening to her dear uncle to cause this sort of a reaction. Her love and gratitude towards him swelled. Images of her growing years flashed through her mind. She didn't remember much of what happened when her parents died, but she did remember her childhood, growing up with a loving uncle. He did all he could to provide food, shelter, and education. He protected her and instilled a strong sense in her of who she was, who her people were. He loved her dearly. Other memories came to her. He had chosen another name for her. How she was taken from him to join other young women in the king's house. A smile played at her lips as she remembered the whole year of pampering she had received in preparation to meet the king. Then she thought about the amazing banquet when she was presented as queen. Royal life separated her from her dear uncle, and she was not able to spend as much time with him as she wished she could. To hear this news about his present condition disturbed her greatly. Her first impulse, of course, was to send him something, so she sent him a new set of clothes, but he refused the gift. What was distressing him so much? She could not imagine what sort of news would make him dress up in sackcloth and be so distressed. Although she was part of the royal family, she took no part in politics. Her uncle, on the other hand, kept himself very well informed. Once before, because of something her uncle had overheard and her intervention with the king, an assassination attempt on her husband's life was foiled. This time, there were so many more lives at stake. Her uncle sent her all the information, including a written publication of the edict that affected everyone who was a Jew. Her uncle urged her to see the king, to beg for mercy, and to plead with him for her people. By now, however, she was very aware of the royal protocols, and due to the previous plot to assassinate the king, security was very tight. Anybody who approached the king would be killed unless the king showed special mercy and held out his sceptre to them. It was a huge risk for her to take. She didn't think she could do it and told her uncle so. But her position as queen would not spare her from the edict. Her uncle was a man of faith. He shared with her that it may have been that God had placed her where she was for this very crisis. Her position made it possible that God could use her to save her people. If she didn't step up now and fight for her people, it could be detrimental for her. God would find other means of helping his people. Have you ever been in this position before? In a position of leadership where you needed to speak on a certain issue or to speak on behalf of someone who had no voice? But speaking out also brought a personal risk to yourself. Did you speak up or did you keep silent? Seriously, this young woman considered her uncle's request. She thought about it and thought about it. There was only one thing to do. We find her answer in Esther 4:15 and 16. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go and gather all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same, and then, though it is against the law, I will go. I will go in and see the king."
Some people can see the future. They're visionary leaders. They see a much bigger picture and adjust their lives accordingly. They also prepare their followers as well as they can. He was one such leader. He clearly saw the future and tried to prepare his team for what was coming. He knew that for them it was going to be an extremely difficult time. It was only a few days, but they would be devastated by the events. For months, if not years, he'd been trying to tell them and help them understand. But it was to no avail because they were completely blind to his vision. This was the last evening he would spend with them. And what better way to spend it than have dinner together? This particular dinner was a yearly event when all families got together to celebrate it. He really wanted this meal to be special for them, one that they would remember. So he changed some of the rituals associated with the occasion, and after the dinner they walked in the garden. They loved their leader and enjoyed that somewhat different celebration. He told them that on this very night they would experience something none of them could expect. They had enjoyed being together and could not understand really what he meant when he said they would desert him. Desert him? This word meant that they would turn away and that they would have their faith in him shaken and that they would be ashamed of him and that they would leave him. What did he mean? He knew how devastated they would be when the event they did not expect, occurred. He had to find some way of bringing them hope, something to bring them out of the bottom of that hole they were about to fall into, something simple yet profound. Have you ever been in a situation where you needed to say something important to someone who was at the crossroads of life, something to give them direction? How were his followers reassured? We read his words in Matthew 26:31 to 32, New Living Translation. "Tonight, all of you will desert me," Jesus told them. "For the scriptures say, God will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've been raised from the dead, I will go ahead. I will go ahead of you to Galilee and meet you there." This is not the first time Jesus had said, "I will go." Long before sin came into the world, knowing that a solution would be required, Jesus had said, "I will go." He knew it would be difficult, very difficult. He knew it would be painful. He would be misunderstood, dishonoured, disrespected, and hated. He knew he would be separated from his Father, and yet he said, "I will go." Why would anybody be willing to go on a mission like that? Today we met Rebecca, Deborah, Ruth, Esther, and Jesus in moments of their lives, in the major moments of their lives. They all had one thing in common. At that crucial time, they needed to make a decision. This decision could affect them personally, or it may affect their whole nation. And in Jesus' case, the decision impacted the whole human race. These life-changing decisions could not be made without the guidance of God. Each made the right decision because of their faith, because of their relationship with God. The decisions are summarised in the words, "I will go. I will do God's will." Today we are all facing decisions. They may not be as big or as impactful as those we have just read about. Perhaps they're decisions that just may be a change of attitude because that's what God wants for you. Perhaps you've been meaning to ask your neighbour for a meal, listen to their story, tell them a story, how God has changed your life. Perhaps there's someone you have hurt and you need to ask them for forgiveness and God is prompting you to forgive them. Perhaps God is calling you to look after that family down the road that their children really need some new clothes. You need to go and listen to their story and tell them about Jesus in a practical way. Perhaps God is calling you to another country to work in a different culture and share the good news there. You can be sure that God will ask you to share the things that he has done for you, those changes that he made in your life. He will only ask you to do what he knows you can do. What is the Holy Spirit whispering in your ear? What does God want you to do today? Will you go where he wants you to go? What will your answer be? Our final hymn now, I can't remember what it is. Thank you.